Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show. A warning to our listeners. This podcast contains discussion about suicide and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. Please note that Pia and I are not experts in this area. I have done the Suicide Assist program in my role as a teacher, and Pia has had personal experience with suicide. If you need support, please contact your local crisis line or helpline, and if you're in Hong Kong and you'd like to call the Samaritans hotline, you can call them on 2896 0000. Today I'm here with Pia Muggerud. Hi Pia, thank you for joining me today.
Hi Jules, it's my pleasure to be here.
Pia, first of all, tell me a little bit about your mum. What was she like and what was her relationship with your dad like?
So my mum, well, you know, on the surface, she was the life and soul of the party. She was larger than life. She had a very easy way to make friends but she really attracted people. And so on many levels, you know, she was incredible, really a bit of a star. But of course, many things for her, she would keep private. And so growing up in our household, it was one of the messages that she would often drill into me is that, you know, keep this inside the family. Do not speak about what happens here outside of the house. And the reality is she did for many years struggle because of childhood trauma that she experienced as a very young girl. And as I got older, those challenges became more and more difficult for her. And of course, the stigma around things like depression still is present today. But even, you know, when I was growing up, you know, let's say 40 years ago, we just didn't talk about the things like that in public. So I think also made her life more difficult, but of course that ripple affected into our family as a whole. And when it comes to her relationship with my father, that was difficult from fairly early on as well. I don't suppose that really helped her. I think she felt very insecure fairly early on in their relationship. It was very rocky I would say from when I was maybe 10, but possibly earlier. And her challenges became worse because of that. And I think that didn't help their relationship either.
So as a child, were you aware that she had depression, even though it was something that wasn't really spoken about?
I would say consciously no. I mean, I do remember when I was very young that my mum was originally from the UK and we lived in Norway. And I remember my English grandmother, as I called her, she came to visit when I was about 6 to take care of us. And that was a time that had been a very difficult time for my mum. But I suppose it wasn't until I was a little bit older that her challenges became more apparent for me. And part of that was that she relied quite heavily on me for her emotional well-being. So I became a little bit of a confidant or crutch for her, especially because of this whole rule that we don't speak about anything difficult outside of the family. I mean, not that we really spoke about them inside of the family. So in psychology, we talk about a child being parentified, where the roles got a little bit switched around. And of course, then it became much more apparent to me the challenges that she was having.
And then what sort of challenges did they face as parents as things started to become apparent to you that she wasn't really very well?
I think the challenges that they faced was they just had a very difficult time to meet in a way that I think is needed in any relationship, being parents or no parents. For anybody who's ever been in a relationship where it's just constantly a battle. And I suppose that my father also wasn't really equipped to understand her deeper needs. And at the same time, I don't think they ever really spoke about, well, what are your needs? What are my needs? How can we meet each other there? And then as parents, I think they had different coping mechanisms. Certainly my father was very involved in my brother and myself. He was very much a hands-on dad. I've always had a very close relationship with him because he became very available for me. And therefore, when those moments when mum was less available, then I got to rely more on him.
Did they stay married or did they end up breaking up because of the stress and pressure?
They did stay married up until her death, actually, but it was always a case of, and this was even spoken, at least by her, is that, we're staying together because of the kids, but then when the kids get older, they stay together anyway. And I think then there were like financial issues, like it becomes more expensive to live apart. Yeah, they never split up, which I think, I knew that from fairly early age, that no matter how painful that would have been, it would certainly have been a much better solution, I think, for both of them.
That's interesting, isn't it? A lot of people do stay together because of the children or for a number of different reasons, but it's not always the best choice. So did your mum get any help with psychologists or psychiatrists or anything like that throughout the time, or was it really kept so private that there wasn't really any support for her?
She took medication in stages. There's many things that are unclear to me because I suppose I never really had those questions at an earlier age. But I know that she had to have an abortion when I was about 6 years old. And the doctors basically told her that because of the medication, the strength of the medication that she was on, that this would have an extremely negative effect on the fetus. And this piece was extremely painful for her. And that just added to the pain that she was already carrying. This was something that she never really was able to get past, having to abort this third child. She was taking medication back then. She didn't constantly take medication, but the time when she was hospitalized, and it was actually just at Millennium. It was just January 2000. And I remember getting a phone call, and I was in Hong Kong. I got a phone call from my father saying that I was hoping that I wouldn't have to call you about this, but mum's got really, really sick. And so at that point, I had not been part of the build up to her needing hospitalization. And I suppose this was a decision my father had made kind of to protect me, which of course I understand. This is probably something that was very painful for him. And so at that point, I traveled back home to Norway and basically took care of her until they found a place for her in a mental institution. And once she got that place, that was very, very good for her. For many, many years, and still, I've had a real passion for psychology. And so I'd actually worked in that institution. So in the summers during my uni, I worked there. And so I really had an insider view of what this place was all about. And so my dad sat us down one night and he said, it looks like your mum's going to need hospitalization. I was like, absolutely, that's great. In fact, in that moment, I was really able to support my dad in that decision because I could tell him, that they really take care of the patients there. She will be well taken care of. She will be good there and she will get the help she needs. I could really tell with my dad that there was a sense of, wow, that it was really good for his soul to hear that. And of course, he knew that I had been working there over the summers, but for me to be able to really be so clear and firm in my in my feeling that this was actually a good thing for her.
And what was the catalyst for her hospitalisation? Was there any sort of incident that triggered her having to go to hospital?
Not that I know of. I think for her, life had been, a daily struggle. And she often relied on alcohol, which for depression, really is not a great solution. But of course, she was looking for any coping mechanism that would get her through the day. When I returned back on that trip, I arrived in the house, and in that moment, my mum was fairly clear. So she recognized me, and she was mum in a sense. But I realized very quickly that she was already somewhere else. And so in the hospital, the psychiatrist found her case quite tricky. They couldn't really pinpoint what was going on for her. They called it a severe depression. She was then on a very heavy dose of antidepressants and antipsychotic medication. So she was also in a type of psychosis where, when I was taking care of her, she really let herself go. I was like making a point of, okay, you've got to have a bath now, something she loved to have. And it was a struggle just to get her to clean herself. And when I looked into her eyes, she wasn't really there. So I think it was in retrospect, it was really a buildup of just not really being able to cope with everyday life. And she just went deeper and deeper into this depression.
And then obviously at some point she was released from hospital. And did she have some sort of recovery from that episode?
At the hospital, they say that, the minimum time that somebody could stay there is 3 months. You need a minimum of that time. She stayed probably about 3.5 months, which is actually a very quick. During that time, she would only see my father. She wouldn't agree to see anybody else, but she did have a quick recovery. Saying that, she was on those medications until her death. And I don't have much understanding of medication as such, but the thing with antidepressants is they want to make sure that you don't get too low, but at the same time, they make sure you don't get too high either. So, she was left in this place of just really fairly flat. So yes, there was a recovery, but she never went off those medications. And she was convinced that she was never able to get off the medication. So the quality of life was very reduced.
Tell me a little bit about her state of mind, or what you know about how she was before she took her own life.
Again, this was another moment in time where I was not really informed about how bad things really were. And, no matter how bad things were for her, I never believed that this would be an outcome that she would choose. Of course, looking back and after the suicide, for example, I read a couple of books and the so many warning signs that were there, but you don't know about those things when you don't anticipate that somebody in your life is going to take their own life. And because I was not physically in the same country, I also didn't know about some of these things. But separately, my brother and my dad shared with me that she had asked each of them separately questions that could very easily have raised alarm bells. But of course, in that moment, it didn't really appear like that. My brother shared with me that one day she had asked him to get a Stanley knife. And my brother's like, what on earth do you need a Stanley knife for? And she said, oh, I'm going to cut some boxes. And he did question her, but at the same time, he didn't really think more of it other than, no issue. You can just use a pair of scissors for that. So there was never a Stanley knife bought for her. And then my father also shared, she had asked him if cleaning detergents, is that what, like what you keep under your kitchen sink? Yeah. Are cleaning detergents poisonous for humans. And again, he just didn't click that this wasn't a random question. But of course, in retrospect, even if we had those two questions together in the same room, that would probably been wait a minute. I don't know how long she would have been having these thoughts, but I know for a very long time she didn't leave the house. That was very, very difficult for her. So my dad really became a caretaker. You can imagine, again, the type of quality of life, not just hers, but for both of them, that was really restricted to just being inside of the house and being consumed by fear.
So she had become a bit agoraphobic as well.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so sad. Tell me a bit about the circumstances around her death and how did you find out about it and how did it impact you?
Before I answer that question, I just want to share something, and that is that I speak for a living. So for me to speak on a podcast is like not a big deal. But I also just want to be very, very real about my shakiness. So on the surface, I'm talking to you, Jules, and we're having I'm really enjoying it. And I really feel that this is an important conversation. But there's a very subtle shakiness in my voice. There's a very subtle shakiness in my hands. So I just feel that it's important for me to kind of expose that although I'm happy to speak about this topic, I'm also noticing it's not easy.
Yeah, I can understand. I'm sure it's really, really difficult. And I really appreciate you having the courage to talk about it and share about it, because I think it's such an important conversation to be had. And I think suicide awareness is really important. So I really appreciate your courage. And of course, if there's anything that I ask you that you're not comfortable in answering, then please say so, because it's a very personal, very, very personal topic. And if you're not comfortable with anything, then please let me know.
Well, I'm totally okay to talk about all of this, but I also feel that for me, it's so important to this whole stigma around not just suicide, but the stigma around not being okay. Like we're so trained to say, "How are you, Jules?" "Oh, I'm great.
I'm fine." Yeah.
And then we move on, right? And so part of my mission and passion in the world is to make it okay to say I'm not okay. So it's absolutely okay to talk about this topic. And if anybody ever asks me about it, I'm very happy to be totally upfront about it. And I'm shaky. And it impacts me to talk about it. And so I just wanted to be really honest and vulnerable about that.
Yeah, and I think that's lovely that you share that vulnerability, because sometimes with audio, it's hard to know how somebody's really feeling while they're speaking. So thank you for sharing that, and take your time and just share as little or as much as you want about this aspect.
So I got another phone call because, of course, I live so many miles away from my family. And my poor father, I just cannot imagine what it might have been for a father to tell his two children that their mother had just committed suicide. It's
unimaginable, isn't it?
Unimaginable. I mean, I know how I felt in that moment. I know how I felt in the days that followed and traveling to Norway from Hong Kong. But I just cannot imagine how distraught he might have been to have to break our hearts like that. So he called me up, and he didn't share too many details in that moment, but of course he did share that the worst thing that can possibly happen to your mother has happened. He said something like that.
Did you understand what he meant?
I did. I mean, I don't remember exactly the words he used, but I did understand what he meant. And I remember just like throwing the phone across the living room, it was and screaming. It was just like this sort of primal scream. The first chance I had to get on a flight was the following evening. And I think everything was just a real daze. I mean, my boyfriend, who's now my husband, he was the one that kind of got online and got us flights, and I couldn't even speak to my closest friends. And I said, please, can you just contact X, Y, and Z? And can you please call Debbie? Can you please call Jen? And just, I can't even utter these words. I can't even begin to, somehow I think if I'd utter those words, it would feel a little bit more real. And I remember thinking, I never asked him what had actually happened. And I was just convinced that she had taken a bunch of pills because she had access to that. And I suppose there was part of me that my inner wisdom knew not to ask. That there was a part of me that needed to be there physically to understand or to hear what had actually happened. Because if I'd known on my own, I mean, it was already devastating, but I think if I'd known on my own what had really happened, it would, I don't know what would be more than devastating, but it would have been very, very difficult. And just to be there with my brother and my dad and grieve together as they told me what had actually happened, I think that was important, because my parents, my father still lives there. They live on a river, and my mother chose to get in the water and drown herself. And my mother was petrified of water. So, for example, the last time we went on holiday together in Thailand, I remember holding her hand for her to just get into, 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters of water. And I was right there next to her holding her hand, because getting any deeper into the water would be just unthinkable for her. She was very afraid. So you can imagine getting the news that somebody who's so afraid of water would be that desperate, because that was, of course, very available right in front of the house.
That does show a level of desperation, doesn't it? Because you'd almost wouldn't believe that would be what she would have chosen because of her fear.
It was absolutely beyond my imagination that, and this, I had this picture of her walking down the path and down towards the water. It just kept on playing and playing and playing inside my head. And it was really too much to bear. And of course, suicide is just too much to bear. But for our family, her choice couldn't have been a worse choice, if that makes sense. It just added to the excruciating pain that we were already in. And so my father had actually woken up to an empty house that morning, the morning of her suicide. And considering she doesn't leave the house, that's already quite a big surprise for him. The godsend, something had happened which somehow supported my dad in that moment, because when he left the house, he could see that there was the emergency services were already there. And his neighbor clicked. There was knowledge there then that a woman had been found. And somehow the neighbor had clicked and stopped my father from going down there. Of course, he had to go and identify her later, but I think somehow missing this piece, not having to be that person to find her, I think feels to me like that eased his pain a little bit, that he didn't have to, on top of everything else, have the burden of discovering her.
It would have just added to the shock. It would have just added to the devastation. It would have been quite traumatic, I imagine.
So he missed that part, which I'm so happy about that. And I'm just going to take a moment. The moment that he called me, he had obviously been waiting for the time difference. And so in that moment, I think he had already been to the morgue. And obviously he couldn't tell me face to face, but he had told my brother that you need to come home because your mum's worse. Because of course he knew that would be a reason for my brother to come. And that of course was his way of being able to get my brother to come to the house so that they could be together when my dad gave my brother the news. And of course, in my case, he had to actually speak to me on the phone.
Because you were so far away, he couldn't get you just to come over.
No. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I'm so moved by this story. I'm really, really, I just feel very, very sad for you. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. So by the time I got back to Norway, which I guess would have been 36, 40 hours after I got the news, they had already dealt with quite a few practicalities. They kind of just ran with it, like going to the funeral parlor and all these different things. My dad had to go and identify her. And they had also then been to see her, I believe. And so when I got back, one of the first things we did was also for me to go and see her at the kind of like the chapel. And I remember my boyfriend was with me. And the one person I really wanted to be there was my cousin. And I remember she was holding my hand. And as we were walking towards this chapel, I was so shaky. And I think there was maybe 4 of us that went, and just like anticipating going there, and was very challenging for me. And one of the things that happened, which actually totally added to the trauma of what's already so unbearable, was that there were bruises on her face. And this for me was, all I can imagine is that this had happened in the water. With the stream of the river, and it was just awful to see this. And one thing that my family had failed to tell me is that this is it called rigor mortis? So this is actually just a natural way for what happens to the body, except nobody told me that. And but for me, seeing my mum was one thing, but these bruises, it was just awful. And and then another movie started playing, in my head.
How would you say that your mother's death impacted you?
I was in therapy for so many years before my mum's death. This is something that's been a really important part of my sanity, being able to just meet myself in my heart rather than playing some role that I was expected to play in my life, which so many of us are trained to do, right? So for me, therapy was just a very natural choice. And actually, that reminds me of something, because what happened was that when my mum was admitted to the mental institution back in 2000, that was a catalyst for me having a depression. I just cried. I would say I cried every day for a year.
Really? That's hectic.
And a big, big fear was that I was going to be like my mother. And I think that was also a fear I had long before she became really sick. During that year, I didn't really have, not the means, but I just didn't really know how to ask for help. So for the longest time, I would buy books, and I started reading, you kind of call them self-help books or whatever, but I would pick up books that would somehow give me some insight into perhaps what was going on for me. And then by the end of that year, I started having counseling. It's the number one best thing I've ever done in my life.
Yeah, it's so good to do, isn't it? It's a great thing.
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely. And, I am a counselor. I am a coach. I facilitate very deep sort of therapeutic processes. So this is something that has been important for me as a kind of passion and area of interest anyway. But back then, when I started receiving the therapy, it was really just to work through some of the things that had been too painful for me to really look at. So fast forward to my mother's suicide, I had done so much work on my relationship with my mom. I'd done so much work on my relationship with my dad. So I suppose I was in a position where my foundation inside of me was extremely solid. Now, I don't mean like rock hard. I mean, this foundation was deep. I had gone so deep inside of myself that had prepared me. Now, I don't mean that this in any way that, oh, well, okay, let's just get on with it. I don't mean it like that, but I meant that I knew on such a deep level that I'm okay. I'm going to be okay, despite of this impossible choice that she's made. And I knew on such a deep level that I am not my mother, which of course had been such a deep fear for me before.
It's so good that you'd done all that work beforehand so that when this tragic event occurred, you didn't go straight to that place. So that's really very, very good, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So Pia, what did grief look and feel like to you?
Well, first of all, grief meant continuing therapy. And things like going to see my therapist and saying to him, I just feel like crawling up in a little ball. And he goes, okay, why don't you do that? And everything was okay. Like the whole piece around therapy allowed me to be okay no matter what. And I was so used to my tears or my anger or all the emotions under the sun with all the work that I've done. They're an okay place for me to go. I don't have to just put on a brave face. So grief also looked like I really was able to allow my feelings to be present moment to moment without feeling shame or feeling like I needed to mask what was happening for me in the moment.
Oh, that's lovely. Can you tell me how long ago did this happen?
10 years ago.
Oh, okay, 10 years ago. And do you feel like grief is something that you can move through? Do you feel like it's something you can overcome? Or do you think it's something that's always with you in some form?
I think grief is always going to be with me. However, I am not run by grief. Grief is not my persona or my identity. It's part of something that's alive inside of me. But what does that look like day to day is that when it shows up, I'm able to be with it. I'm able to express it. And then I can go, okay. And then I can move on. So for example, this morning I was having a sharing with a friend. And I was telling her that I was having this interview. And I was like thinking about this interview, I'm like, easy peasy. But then when I was sharing with her, I noticed like an ache around my heart becoming more and more. And then I noticed my hands were shaking. And I shared that with her. like I was sharing what I had for breakfast. Like, I can only speak about grief in certain moments, and I can only speak about happiness otherwise. I don't distinguish, like if I'm with somebody, a trusted friend, and somebody I know is okay to hear me out and hold space for me. And I have a lot of those people in my life that really I've created through all the work I've done, I've created a way that I'm able to be with it and allow it to be seen and heard when it needs to be. And then it can go back in a place that somewhere inside of me until next time it feels like it needs to be felt.
I think that's really lovely, the way that you've put that. And I think that is going to be so helpful for a lot of people who are perhaps in the early stages of grief, to really understand the way that you can work through it and allow yourself to be vulnerable, but also compartmentalize it when you need to, but also don't feel shame and be able to speak about it when you need to with trusted people. I think that's really, really lovely. So thank you for sharing that. Am I right in saying that your mother's brother committed suicide as well?
Yes.
Was this before or after? Oh my gosh, they were twins. And was it before or after your mum passed away?
It was around 5 years after my mum passed away. And I didn't know my uncle very well. I mean, that's just rooted in the big trauma that my mum was living through all her life. And that was that she had sexual abuse from her stepfather when she was 6. And when that happened, she was sent away. She was sent away from her twin brother, and she was sent away from her mother. And so you can imagine that the twins were also separated. And I think part of, at least from my mother, the separation from her mother was something that was the most painful thing for her. I can only imagine that her twin brother would have then experienced difficulty himself with everything that had happened, his sister being sent away. And, I don't really know his relationship with his stepdad. So when I was growing up, we were not in my younger days, I was not allowed to see my grandmother because she was still married to this man. It was later on when my grandmother left him that we started a relationship, but somehow with my mum's twin brother, my uncle, that was never really rekindled somehow. So I don't know so much about his life, but, it just goes to show that he obviously had a very, very difficult childhood as well for him to also make that choice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sad. It's very, very sad. So, Pia, you spoke during National Suicide Prevention Week about your mother and your uncle's suicide. What inspired you to share your story and speak up about them?
I've not written or spoken out a lot about suicide before. And it was like 10 years since my mum's death. I just thought to myself that I know that the only people that can really understand this devastation that suicide brings are people that have had this experience. So I thought, okay, well, even long before suicide, people struggle. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I don't think somebody just wakes up and makes that choice in a day. It happens over time. The pain becomes so unbearable. So I feel for me, it's about normalizing pain and destigmatizing emotional distress or any mental health issues. And I think if I can have a small part in making it easier or creating a society where we more openly discuss our struggles, more openly share that I'm not okay or I'm having a hard time, then we're not necessarily giving people permission to do the same, but just like, wow, this person is speaking up. Maybe I can say something. Maybe it's not so bad if I say something. For me, it's really about making our struggles more public so that it's easier for others that maybe don't feel so strong about saying something.
Yeah, I think that's a really great goal, and I think that that's why it's so important to be having this conversation. Do you think that suicide can be prevented
Absolutely.
through opening up the conversations about how people are feeling, mental health issues and things like that? Do you think that's one way? What other ways?
Years ago, I read a piece of research on suicide that over many, many years, they had followed people that had attempted suicide at the Golden Gate Bridge. And this is a very common occurrence at the Golden Gate Bridge outside San Francisco. And they followed people that had been stopped in the moment.
There's a documentary on it. I've seen it. I think it's called The Bridge. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And what they found was that years later, when they kept following up with these people that had attempted suicide, none of them died from suicide. Some of them had died from natural causes, but none of them had attempted suicide again. So that tells me that often suicide could be like, in this moment, everything feels unbearable. But if we can get them to hold on a little bit longer, what about 1 hour later or 2 hours later or even a day later? I guess that's really what the study showed, that people take action often in this moment, in that moment in time. It is so dark, but that's not necessarily as dark hours or days later. So part of what I said earlier about destigmatizing mental health challenges is that if we speak more openly about our struggles, then I feel that it will be one way then that I'm maybe going to speak up to you before it gets so bad. They go hand in hand.
And how important do you think education programs are about mental health and suicide and speaking up when you feel like you need help?
Well, I feel very strongly that we should teach kids about it's okay to say how you feel and teach ways of sharing that. And then really acknowledge and creating a safe space for children who actually naturally just say how they feel. And then at a certain point in time, we wake up one day and we go, well, no, it's not okay to say that we're not okay anymore. It used to be. And so I really feel that it needs to be included in schools, and literally like maths or English or geography. It just simply needs to be a subject that we learn about or kids learn about, because then it's just normal. Then things that we don't talk about, things that we shove under the rug, I don't know why it's not okay, but it's clearly not okay. So I'm just going to keep quiet.
And then things get worse, and that's when people become desperate. So in schools programs, then we can share with people how they can get help and what kind of support networks are out there for them and the different ways that they can be supported with mental health issues. And that there's no shame in mental health as well. If people have depression or they're bipolar or anxious or whatever it is, there shouldn't be any shame associated. People will happily talk about their diabetes or their pneumonia or other physical illnesses, but for some reason we don't have the same openness about mental health. So that's what I'm really hoping will come from conversations like this, that people will start to actually have these conversations about mental health as well and understand that it's okay to not be okay, as you said.
Yeah. When I read a couple of books on suicide post my mother's death, nobody's going to pick up a book about suicide unless it's a speciality of theirs, right? And I sit there reading and it's like, wow, if I'd known all of this before, that would have equipped my family in a very different way. So if we already, from grade 1, we just learn that all these things are okay. Anger is okay. Sadness is okay, just as happiness and joy. We don't ever have to get to the point where we need to read about suicide per se. But even if we bring topics about suicide into the classroom, it's just very normal to talk about, because you've learned from age 6 or whatever that feelings are okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that there are certain behaviours that people should be on the lookout for that might indicate that somebody's considering suicide?
Well, obviously, depression is a big one. Previous suicide attempts, things like if you have a history of substance abuse or a variation of mental health conditions. Doesn't have to be just be depression. It can be anxiety, and trauma is a very big piece, PTSD, things like that. One thing I've also learned is that cyberbullying is huge. And I read recently that kids that have experienced cyberbullying are twice as likely to attempt suicide than kids that have not experienced cyberbullying. And of course, now kids are, always on their devices, and they're always on, TikTok or Instagram or whatever the latest thing is. I mean, kids, I'm sure you know this as well as a teacher, kids spend a lot of time in the cyber world.
A lot of kids also, they're bullied for being different, whether they're LGBTQ or whether they're a different race or from a different cultural background or a different religion or whatever it is. Young people will find a way to bully others online, and it's so much easier online because you're behind the computer. You're not doing it face to face. People can be so much nastier. But I do think that, yes, there's a lot of suicides linked to bullying and trolls and online behaviour. And so I think that that's another conversation that needs to be had in schools, that children know how to reach out for help and how to block people and get support from family or teachers or whoever it is, even police. I think a lot of kids suffer in silence because they feel so low about whatever it is that they're being bullied for, so they don't feel worthy of seeking help. So I hope that that can change. And I hope also through education programs, young people will understand the power of their words and how harmful they can be.
And I suppose that just brings us back to this piece around education, and bringing education and awareness into the school system is even more important now, because with, the internet, more and more people are isolated. And I'm not just talking about COVID, I'm talking just in general. We're just not connecting in the same way that we might have done 20, 30 years ago, looking into each other's eyes. And that already you can read so much from a person. So if I'm texting you, I don't know how you're feeling, but if I'm with you and I look into your eyes, that can inform me a lot about where you're at, even if you're maybe not saying anything. So we're losing with the internet, then we're also losing so much. Humans are hardwired for connection. And with the internet, we're actually thinking we're connected, but we're actually often the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much can be lost in translation on the internet. Do you think there are certain risk factors for suicide? People who are isolated, people who have had a change in circumstances, people who do struggle with mental health, which we've already talked about. I think loneliness can be a huge risk factor. I think bullying can be a huge risk factor. Trauma. I wonder if there's anything else that springs to mind.
Like what I shared earlier about my mum was actually making preparations through those questions that she asked my brother and my dad, right?
And also some people get their affairs in order, don't they, beforehand? That can be a behaviour, which could be an indicator. And some people isolate themselves and don't interact socially, or they just have, change in moods. There's so many things, but people can behave like that anyway without there being a risk of suicide as well. And quite often some people commit suicide and there's no signs or there's no warning. So it can just vary so much, I think. But I think the important thing is to be having these conversations.
But I think what you just said now as well, Jules, is that somebody can take their own life and nobody would ever know about it. I mean, that just kind of highlights everything that we've just talked about. Our society now kind of allows that to happen, that somebody feels like there's nobody I can talk to. This is too dark. I cannot burden other people with this. And I'm already so ashamed that if I told this to anybody, it would already be unbearable. If there was a place that person felt they can speak or have a place to go to that's safe,
that could make all the difference. And then for some, it may not. That's why it's such an intricate topic with so many layers. Do you think it's okay to ask somebody directly if you're concerned about them, if they're feeling suicidal?
Yes.
It's important, isn't it? So I did the Suicide Assist course recently. And in that training, it's an amazing course. And in that training, we learned that if you're worried about somebody, it is important that you ask them directly, are you feeling suicidal? And people will answer yes or no. And if they answer yes, then you have to kind of work out how serious the plan is or whether they have a plan. And then from there, your role is to keep them safe in that moment and get them professional support. You don't have to fix the problem. You don't have to, look after them for the next week or 2 weeks or whatever. You need to just, in the moment, give them first aid so that they stay safe until you can get them professional support. So I think that that's a really good message for people to take away, because I think some people are worried about asking the question, or they think they might be putting the idea in somebody's head, but people are not just going to go, oh, yeah, hang on, I hadn't thought of that, but now I'll do it. And generally people who, if they are suicidal and you ask them, they want to talk about it often and they'll say yes.
I think one of the challenges, again, is that most people don't feel equipped. I'm so scared of asking my friend John because, well, then what am I going to do?
Yeah, so what are they going to do, Pia? If somebody says they're suicidal, what do you think they should do for their friend?
For me, at least, it's not an easy kind of a cookie cutter answer. But I think that a big piece is just being with them. And I think so many of us, we're not even used to somebody really being with us. Like, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. You're not alone. For somebody to hear that in this quite isolated world, I feel that that's already like, really? And even if I'm to hold your hand right now and I said, I'm right here, just feeling the presence of somebody who's available right now, right here, right now, I think is a great first step.
Absolutely. And I think if people did want to know what the next step would be, I think it's getting them to help, which could be a psychologist, a psychiatrist. It could be a GP. It could be your pastor. There's a number of people in the community that can offer support, or calling an ambulance and getting them to hospital, depending on the risk. There are many things that you can do. And then once you've done that, then the professionals can hopefully take over. So I think that for people out there listening, I think it's good to have solutions. Like in Australia, there's Lifeline that you can call to get help and support and advice. In Hong Kong, there's the Samaritans that you can call. So in most countries, there is some phone number that you can call to get immediate support. There's also a webpage called Beyond Blue in Australia, which offers outstanding support for mental health situations.
To add to that, I think that it's not just about, I'm here now with my friend who says she's suicidal, but it's also for that person that is starting to have those kind of conversations in their head. They can pick up, let's say, the Lifeline or the Samaritans hotline, and somebody is there.
Yes, so you're not alone. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's great advice. And I'll put the links in the show notes to some of these support networks that we're talking about, because I think it's really, really important that people know about it. So I was reading your post on Facebook, Pia, during National Suicide Week. So on Facebook, you shared a quote from a therapist and truth teller called Dr. Gabor Mate, and it said, it was about the wisdom of trauma, and we've all suffered from trauma to some extent, which is not always the huge experience, but often daily painful experiences that we internalize. The loneliness, the shame, the pain we carry on our own. So what does this mean to you, and why do you think it's important to have these conversations about our feelings? We've talked a lot about that already, but what does that quote mean to you?
I also just want to say that Dr. Mate is somebody who worked for many, many years with the worst type of addicts in Vancouver, Canada. His conclusions again and again came back to trauma. And I would say that mental health suicide is absolutely linked to trauma. And I think trauma is such a big, heavy word that there's like, I had a trauma in a car crash, or I was attacked, or I had, or rape. You know, we look at trauma as in very, very big things. But in fact, more and more trauma specialists and psychiatrists, etc., they're seeing more and more that trauma are the small things. Like it could be something as simple as the child is crying longer, that, you know, the baby is in the crib and it's having to cry 3 more minutes than because mom is on her way. Now that could be a trauma, right? So something as small as that. And I think we don't really give ourselves the space, and I guess ourselves the compassion that we've all gone through difficult things. And the thing is, society, again, we just want to brush it off. Oh, it's not a big deal. I'm stronger because of it, rather than stopping and allowing and acknowledging that I've had some difficult experiences, and I'm just through being able to acknowledge that can be very healing. And it just comes back to opening up the whole conversation around I'm not okay and it's okay.
And I'm not alone. I liked when you said that as well. I'm not alone, and there are support networks available. I think that's important as well.
As we get more accustomed to sharing and speaking up, then that whole I'm not alone becomes more real and tangible. I was on the Lama Ferry, where Jules and I both live, and I bumped into a fellow coach, and she asked me, you know, the typical, how are you? And I went, you know what? I'm not great. Feeling a bit shitty today. And her response was, oh, don't be like that. Point is that this is our conditioning. We are so conditioned to, oh, Pia's actually telling the truth in this moment. She was just expecting me to say, I'm okay.
But I think also there's this thing where you've just politely saying, oh, how are you today? But you don't really want to know. It's like saying lovely weather today, isn't it? It's the same kind of thing. It's sort of just a banal way of connecting. And I think there's a message in that if you are really struggling, find the right person, because there are people in your life who really will be willing to listen. And I think it's not just in that passing acquaintance where somebody says, how are you? And you go, actually, I'm feeling terrible. You've got to reach out to a parent, a sibling, a close friend, a teacher, a pastor, a doctor. You know, there's plenty of people in the community that can help and support.
The way that I said it was really coming from this place of, I'm not asking anything from you. I'm just going to be honest. You know, I'm having a bit of a crappy day. I don't need anything from you. And I suppose that just comes back to the fact that, you know, I really want to be that person that has the freedom to say that without anybody trying to fix me or make it or change me or make it go away. But I think I kind of shocked her a little bit, but I suppose I did expect, because she's somebody that I anticipated, because of our relationship, would be able to just say, I'm sorry to hear that.
Also, I think that's important, that you also recognize that if somebody does say to you, I'm not feeling okay or I'm struggling, you don't have to solve the problem. You just need to be a listening ear. And then, you know, if you're feeling that things are worse or really terrible, that's when you can ask, are you feeling suicidal? And if they say yes, that's when you need to get them support. But sometimes you just need to listen. And of course, everybody who's having a bad day or is not feeling great, it doesn't mean they are suicidal. But it's okay to ask that question. And I think that if we open up that dialogue with more and more people, then that can be a way of also preventing more suicides.
In my particular instance, it could have been something simple as one more question. Do you need anything right now? What do you need right now? And I would have very simply said, I don't need anything. I'm okay as I am. But since you asked me, I'm being honest.
So do you have any regrets, or do you have any thoughts about regrets when it comes to suicide? And I haven't lost anyone close to me personally to suicide, so I'm only imagining this. But I imagine people often think, what if, or if only, or perhaps I could have. Is that a normal way to feel when you are somebody who's lost someone to suicide, do you think?
I feel that that's probably quite normal and quite realistic for us to go down that route.
It's human nature, isn't it, really?
For sure. I mean, I think for most of us, it's just so inconceivable that we would end up losing somebody to suicide. And I suppose, as I say that, I guess a regret of mine would be around sometimes just asking questions. It's not the big things like, oh, I should have not moved to Hong Kong, so I would have lived in Norway and then I would have stopped this suicide, for example. It's not big things like that, but it's more about, could I have asked a question that might have made my mother feel like this was her only option? I suppose could I have been more available is one that I've gone down quite a bit. And, I'm quite at peace with that, because I've also, realized that my mother's health was not my responsibility, although I did carry it for many years, but ultimately that was not my responsibility. So personally, I've been able to find peace inside of that, but I think inevitably somebody who suffered this would question themselves and think about, what could I have done differently?
Yeah, it's just normal, isn't it? It's absolutely normal. So you're a suicide loss survivor because you have lost somebody to suicide. How can people support someone like you who has gone through such a tragic experience in your life?
In my life, I have made my number one support system my therapy. So that means I've really gone down the route of working with people that are equipped to hold me through something this excruciating. And so for me, it's really been about going somewhere where I can really feel safe to work through my pain and my grief. But aside from that, I think the most important thing is for friends and relatives to not go down the route of, I've suddenly got to be the person that I'm responsible for this person's well-being. I would say, speaking from my own experience, that's not what I need. I need somebody to say, I'm here. I can't possibly imagine what you've gone through. And hopefully I'll never will. But I am here. If you need a shoulder, if you need to talk to somebody, if you just need to be heard, if you need a hug, if you need me to hold your hand, if you need to call me in the middle of the night, whatever, to just make yourself available in a non-judgmental, just empathy. My friends don't have to fix anything, but it's more about allowing that your friend or loved one to feel like you're available and there for them.
Yeah, that's great. And I think also you've touched on not having to fix something. You don't have to have all of the answers. And I think some people fear opening up Pandora's box or opening up to difficult conversations or something that's going to make them feel a little bit emotional or uncomfortable. You just need to be there for that person. And it's not something that you should fear. Pia, we also, just before we started, we talked about the WHO, the World Health Organization, and that they've done a study recently. Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think this is really important data that pretty much backs up everything that we've spoken about. And it also highlights the importance of the responsibility of companies and organizations. So the World Health Organization, they did this groundbreaking study, but it was back in 2016. And they actually forecasted that for 2020, mental health issues, such as, any sort of emotional disorder or depression or substance dependence, will surpass all physical diseases as the leading cause of disability in the US.
Wow. Did they know that COVID was coming? Did they know that everyone was going to be socially isolated? That's amazing. That's quite spooky.
And a big part of this finding was, in fact, they highlighted isolation. So that was already coming before COVID. But then they also found that depression would become so widespread and magnified by social isolation that it would become the most expensive disease in the world by 2030.
Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? And scary.
The physical diseases are already in the past. They were looking at this issue inside of companies to look at productivity. And they were linking mental health issues with economic productivity. And because of either people being absent from work or being at work, but only, not really being at work, they're physically at work, it's costing the world almost $1 trillion annually.
Wow. Oh my gosh. So this is a timely conversation that we're having. It really is a timely conversation.
What's great about why companies should be interested in implementing programs, offering, let's say, counseling, etc., inside of their organization is that part of this study showed that with every $1 that was invested in treating some of these disorders like depression, the return on investment was $4.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So, Pia, this year for National Suicide Awareness Week, the tagline was #KeepGoing. How can individuals keep going?
I think there are some very basic things that can support people to keep going. And if we go back to this whole piece about isolation, people that are not okay in whatever way, be it depressed or have anxiety or whatever else, tend to isolate anyway. And so I think one of the great ways to keep going is to start looking at, well, what are some basic structure that I can put in my life? Like, for example, like for my mom that wouldn't leave the house, if you don't want to leave the house, then okay, well, can I do some stretching, some physical movement? Being connected with the body. There's so many studies done on this where like we are a society that lives in the head. The more you can start moving your body and therefore connecting more with your body, you can actually gain a deeper connection with yourself. And of course, we all know the benefits of moving the body. So even just like you're going to give yourself, okay, I'm going to do 10 minutes of stretching in the morning. And if you're somebody that you're okay to go out, then okay, I'm going to go for a walk around the block. So moving the body is an important piece. But I also think like having healthy structures in your life. So if you, maybe one of the things you love to do is read, but you haven't done that for a while. So decide that, okay, I'm going to do some reading or meditation. Meditation is a kind of like a fast track way to connecting deeper with yourself in the moment. The thing with people that struggle with mental emotional issues, they're often regurgitating what either happened in the past or afraid of what's going to happen in the future. Whereas meditation and mindfulness, it brings you right here, right now. And therefore, those voices have less of a hold on you. There are free apps with meditation, guided meditations. If you go on YouTube, there's all sorts of short or long ways of listening to beautiful music or somebody speaking, just guiding you into relaxation. That's another wonderful way to just equip yourself with saying that, I'm doing a couple of small things every day. And that is a way to just put one foot in front of the other.
It's about mindfulness, well-being, self-care, whatever it is that you can do for yourself to put yourself first. Pia, thank you so much for this conversation today. I just feel so honoured that you've been able to share your story with me and open up and be vulnerable about such a difficult topic. You've done it beautifully, and I just think that this conversation is just really going to help so many people out there on so many different levels. So thank you for choosing me to talk to, and thank you for opening up and sharing. And I just think, I'm really proud of you, and I know that you're going to be helping others through this conversation. So thanks a lot.
Well, it's absolutely been my pleasure. And I suppose what I want to say is that you're actually the one that reached out to me. Your wisdom and to use your platform in such a way that gives people access to this conversation is really important as well. Your platform is not shying away from something as difficult as a topic about suicide, that you're also willing to not be an expert in suicide, but put it on the table as a conversation that we can have in order to perhaps, even if we just touch one or two other people, then we've done a great thing here.
Absolutely. And for anybody out there who is listening and is not feeling okay or is struggling with suicidal thoughts, then please reach out and get help. And there'll be information in the show notes of how you can get support. And for my listeners out there, if you could go to iTunes to rate and review us, it'll help get me up the iTunes charts. And it will also help people hear Pia's story and open up the conversation about mental health and suicide, which is really, really important. So thank you again, Pia. It's been absolutely amazing. I really, really appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Thank you, Jules.
So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.